Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. Today, my friends, we are once again talking about the Call of Duty Warzone meta, the Season 3 meta, because honestly, as it stands, this is probably the best meta that we've ever had in Warzone history. Of course, way back at the start of Warzone in March of 2020, April of 2020, everyone was still just learning the game. We didn't know what the best spots were to land. We didn't know what the best weapons were, what the best attachments were. We were still very early on into the stages of the game at that point. Pretty much nobody knew what they were doing. It was all just like one big experimental or trial period, basically, when it comes to all the weapons and everything about the meta. So at that point, you could kind of use whatever because no one was really using anything that dominant. Whereas now we know the game like it's the back of our hand, right? We know everything about it. We know the rotations. We know what the go-to setups are, what attachments do what. For the most part, sometimes it's a little bit wonky, but we pretty much know Warzone from front to back at this point, which makes finding out the meta a lot easier. And when you have super broken weapons or super broken aspects of the game, that stuff is discovered relatively quickly now. But when it comes to the meta at this point, we're almost back to that starting point where you can kind of use whatever you want and you can get away with it just because things are pretty balanced for the most part. But that said, we do have even more weapon tuning coming soon that's going to make the meta even more competitive, which honestly, you love to see. So today we're going over the entire Season 3 meta, basically breaking down why it is as good as it is and what's to come here in the future with the other changes that Raven has already teased. As always, if you enjoy the video at any point, let me know by dropping a like on it. Let's go for 4,000 likes on this one. And if you guys are new to the channel or if you haven't already subbed, something like just over 50% of you guys aren't already subscribed to the channel. So if you want to stay up to date with pretty much everything going on in COD, this is the place to be. So feel free to subscribe with your notifications turned on. All right, so the first thing I want to do when it comes to the new Season 3 meta is revisit the tier list that we made quite some time ago. I believe this was just past the 1.33 update or something. This was prior to Season 3, and since then, of course, we've gone back in some recent videos and adjusted things accordingly to, reorganize the meta and what we think is a top weapon, what we think is a competitive weapon, so on and so forth. Now that said, I have gone ahead, I've updated it. We've got some of the new weapons that we're going to place into some categories here, but basically, we can now look at this, especially with the changes that we know are coming, and pretty much break down why this is the best meta that we've ever had, and look at these weapons in a new light. Of course, we've been looking at this quite a bit recently. We've placed the weapons here, especially after the recent updates, and things are looking pretty good, but like I said, they're about to get even better. But when it comes to some of the newer weapons that we haven't officially placed in categories, we've got the PPSH. Honestly, it got the recent buff, and I think that makes it viable. Borderline competitive, but we do have some other pretty solid SMGs that I'd probably take over it. But if you want to use the PPSH now, especially after the most recent buff to it, it's definitely a viable choice at the very least. We also have the Swiss K31. Again, I'd probably say viable. It's definitely not my first choice for a sniper. There's quite a few others that I would take over it, but if you want to mess around with it, it's not the worst sniper in the world, I guess. I mean, it's definitely better than, say, the Dragunov or the MK2 when it comes to a medium to long range weapon. We've got the Carve 2 rifle. I would say this is easily viable. Again, borderline competitive. It's really good for medium range fights, not ideal for some of the longer range fights. Then finally, we've got the Psychov pistol, which I would say probably is competitive for the pistol category. We'll move it up here with the other ones that we've got for the time being. But obviously, when you look at the top meta, the competitive and the viable categories, these are the weapons that you can pretty much use and get away with using, especially the ones more so in the competitive category here. I mean, the Diamatti, the M19, and the Psychov are all great secondaries. The Tundra used to be really, really good before it got that recent sort of stealth nerf with the velocity and the max range for it, but overall, I'd say it's still probably one of the best Cold War snipers. I don't know if we have the ZRG listed as a weapon on here. I don't know if I've grabbed that one yet, but the ZRG is definitely in competitive because it has such good velocity now, but Tundra's borderline there. SPR and the Car, of course, are both great marksman rifles / snipers for Warzone and have been for quite some time. The Car, I feel like, is the best in the game right now. Thus why it's the only one in the top meta spot in terms of you want to use this and you really don't have a reason to use anything else. When it comes to the long range meta, you have the Car, you could use the Tundra, you could use the SPR, you could use the Pellington or the M82 HDR AX50, which are definitely in competitive now because of the recent stealth changes. But you could just use the Car and you're not going to have any problems with it, whereas you might run into some other issues with some of these other ones. So that's why it's by itself up there. But overall, I mean, M16 still really good. Stoner, PK, and Bruin, all great LMGs that are sort of underutilized because they are a bit slower. But now with this new meta where we have no longer the double AR meta with the AMAX and the Krig or AMAX and Farah, so on and so forth, we're back to that sort of medium and long range weapon with an SMG or a shotgun for close range. Thus why we have things like the Gallo up in here. But there is one thing in specific that I really do want to look at, and that's the fact that Raven said in the future they are going to focus on buffing some Modern Warfare weapons to make those more competitive, because there are quite a few underutilized Modern Warfare weapons, and we'll look more at that in just a second over on Warzone Ranked. But when it comes to the tier list, we can already spot a few weapons that are severely underutilized here in Warzone that are Modern Warfare weapons. The Bison versus the Bullfrog, I mean, they're pretty much the same gun, just from different games, and you have no reason to use the Bison compared to the Bullfrog because the Bullfrog's stats are just better in pretty much every single way. This is something that I definitely think is going to be buffed. So when we're talking the future of the Season 3 meta and the future of just the Warzone meta in general, the Bison is definitely one I'd have my eye on for something that could be adjusted and buffed in order to make it a bit more competitive. Same deal with the MK2. This thing just shoots marshmallows, bro. It's a Nerf gun. It doesn't do any damage in Warzone. Just not a good weapon whatsoever. I would never recommend using this on a loadout because you're not going to win fights with it if the enemies are the least bit competent, right? So this is another one, definitely needs some buffing to make it competitive. Same deal with the Dragunov. I'm gonna keep it a buck. I hate the Dragunov. You guys know how I feel about it if you've been long-time subs on the channel. Even if this does get buffed, I'm not using it. Can't stand that gun, but it's another one that you have no reason to use right now. It's awkward, it's clunky, it's not it. So all three of these Modern Warfare weapons in the garbage category right now definitely could use some adjusting. Niche, as we've talked about before, is not a bad category. It's just a different category. The Val, I don't feel like needs a buff. If they did buff it and they gave it like a larger magazine, it'd probably be one of the best guns in the game. Probably like one or two best in the game just because it's so powerful, but it's sort of held back by that smaller magazine. The below average category, I think, is where we're going to see the most adjustments between this and Viable, probably. The FR556 could use some adjustments. It could go sort of either way. It's not the worst gun in the world, but it's definitely not the best option, especially when it comes to the burst meta where we have the M16 and the Carve, which I'd choose every single day of the week over this. But the Scar is one that I definitely think could use some adjustments. The thing is, though, when they talk about they want to buff Modern Warfare weapons and make them more competitive, they don't specify if that comes down to, you know, making stat changes and giving this, you know, less recoil or more damage, which, by the way, doesn't need more damage, or if they want to actually change weapon aspects and give it a bigger magazine or give it a different barrel or something like that. Like, let's say the Scar got a 50-round mag, one of the best guns in the game, in my opinion. It's got the recoil, so I feel like it'd sort of be similar to the AMAX in that sense. Not the easiest to use, but definitely worth it if you're a good player. The Scar is one that I do think they are going to adjust, because it doesn't get any attention right now, and we'll see that in just a second over on Warzone Ranked. But it could be really good with just a slight bit of tuning here and there. Pretty much same deal with the Uzi as well. I mean, this thing has a small mag, and that's why I think most people don't go for it. It's good in like solos and duos, just like the Val or even the Scar, honestly. But it just doesn't have that big magazine to compete in most game modes like trios or quads, or really any kind of hectic fight, just because you're going to spend too much time reloading. The Striker really underperforms as an SMG. The damage and the mobility just really aren't ideal. It's got some range for what it's worth, comparatively speaking, but where an SMG is supposed to shine, the Striker does not. It's really not a great option, so that's another one. Probably should be buffed. And ISO is basically like the little brother of the Fennec. I think the Fennec we have up in here in Viable and Competitive, and pretty much everything the ISO can do, the Fennec can do better. So like, why use the ISO, right? And as we've talked about before, the devs are pushing for diversity. They want the most open meta possible, basically, right? We've covered this in previous videos. So as it stands, you have no reason to use the ISO because you can use the Fennec, and that's not what they want to see from a dev standpoint. And obviously, if you're an ISO fan, you want to be able to use the ISO and not get shut down by other SMGs. So another one that I think could use some buffs to make it a bit more competitive. Even in the Viable category, I feel like we might see some changes here. The P90 could maybe use a slight buff. The AUG could use a slight buff. Both of those would then be like top tier competitive SMGs compared to both the MP5s, the MAC-10, so on and so forth. I feel like the AN-94 and the Modern Warfare AK-47 could also each use a slight buff. Of course, as it stands right now, again, going back to the same conversation of you can use this, but you could just be better to use this. Cold War AK-47, Modern Warfare AK-47. You have no reason to use the Modern Warfare one just because the AK-47 from Cold War is better. So they minimize the recoil on the Modern Warfare version. Suddenly, it's a pretty popular rifle, in my opinion. And A94, I'm not really sure what they could do here, but I feel like it does need some more love. Odin could have the same argument as the Scar, maybe a bigger mag. It becomes way, way better. And M13, I honestly think is pretty good. It's sort of an underrated weapon. It doesn't have the best damage in the world, but it is very easy to use. So that's another one that could maybe go either way. But overall, I mean, you look at this. So many weapons in competitive here. I'm going to count off screen and then cut to it. So between top meta, competitive, and viable, we've got 60 weapons. 61 if you want to include the ZRG, which I forgot to put on here. That's massive, bro. Like, that is so many different weapons that you can use. Obviously, some are going to be better than others. Like, I definitely take things like the AK-47, the RAM, the M4, the Grau, so on and so forth, over things like the QBZ or the Groza. But if you wanted to use some of these more viable weapons, you could, just depending on the lobby, depending on the gunfight. Whereas before, you absolutely could not use some of these. Like, you would get shut down by an AUG or an FFAR or an M16, whatever it was. This meta is insane, and especially when you look at what other weapons could be buffed, some of these Modern Warfare ones that are sort of the undesirables right now, you could say, that adds even more. So 65 weapons, 69 weapons, nice. This meta is about to be in the most open place it's ever been, where it already is in the most open place it's ever been, in my opinion. So big things are coming for the meta, but that's not all. We also have Warzone Ranked, which we've also talked about on the channel in the past, and this is a great site for just getting general loadout stats and whatnot. Shows you what weapons have the highest KD. Obviously, the Street Sweeper and the AMAX are pretty solid right now. The AK-47, the Carve is up there, and some of the more popular weapons as well. The Car, which of course we know is top meta, so that's no surprise. The Kilo is coming up in popularity because of all the recent adjustments, but what we want to look at again is the loadouts and the meta coefficient, because as you can see, this is where they made all the Season 3 adjustments, right? The 21st, I think, was actually the end of Season 2. Season 3 comes out, and this drops from 0.79, almost 0.8, to 0.74, which is a pretty significant drop-off, especially considering what this graph is. It's from 0.64 to 0.82, so you're not looking at a huge difference, but obviously, the numbers actually are quite different. This, of course, is the launch of Warzone, where, like I said earlier, no one knew what they were using. This is about just 2 months into the lifespan of Warzone, and we're at 0.75, right? So even though this might not look that low because you have this sort of swaying it lower visually, you could say almost, 0.74 around this point, 2 months into Warzone, 0.74 now, 14 months into Warzone, something around that mark. We're pretty much back to the start of Warzone when it comes to people using different weapons. If you don't understand this graph, by the way, the lower this graph is, the lower this number is, the more weapons are being used. The higher it is, the less number of weapons are being used. So this is like prime DMR, FFAR, AUG, M16 meta right here, where it's almost 0.8 and is actually above 0.8 around the holidays. This was like prime Bruin meta and Grau meta over here. So we're coming up on the point where this actually is where it was the best. It was around the 0.7 mark actually here during like the end of Season 4, 5, and 6, and around that area when it was a lot of the Kilo and like that very open meta there. We're getting back to that point, and honestly, this is going to continue going down in my opinion as we get those Modern Warfare weapon buffs. And when you look at the popularity here, obviously we've checked this out before as well. Car number 1, no questions asked there. AMAX, even despite the nerf, is actually getting used a little bit less, but really that nerf didn't do all that much to it. It's still a very, very good rifle, probably the best long-range rifle in my opinion. The Krig was getting used a lot prior to this. I would expect this to maybe drop off a little bit. Like we said earlier, the Kilo is now getting used more because of all the recent changes, which made some of the Modern Warfare rifles a bit more appealing. FFAR is going down, Grau is going up, same deal with the Kilo here. I feel like those two are sort of tethered together. If the Kilo gets used more, the Grau gets used more because it's sort of just preference there. Grau gang, by the way. Farah was really good last season, now dropping again, but obviously those are some of the more popular weapons. We know about those because they're in every loadout video and whatnot. Let's go down to the bottom. Let's look at some of these Modern Warfare weapons that aren't really that utilized. The Rogue, I'm actually kind of surprised it's not used because it's a decent shotgun, especially was during the Fires shotgun meta, but we talked about the Striker 45, almost no one's using this, and the KD with it is really not all that good. This, of course, this category here is the average KD ratio with that weapon. So the KD on the Striker 45, really not good whatsoever. We've got the MK2, which I also mentioned is not really used, and it's really not a solid weapon whatsoever. The SA-87 is getting a bit more attention now, which is definitely a good thing. It's a solid weapon, honestly, very, very underrated. M91 is underutilized. We've got the FR556, the Holger, the Dragunov, the ISO, the Uzi, the Scar. So all weapons that we saw at the very bottom of the tier list, which of course that tier list is opinionated based on what I think is good and what I think is bad. But, you know, I feel like I know enough about the meta to, you know, speak with some certainty there. But these are all weapons that we said weren't very good and could use a buff, and they're not utilized. They don't really get much attention, and that's exactly what Raven mentioned. We want to buff some of those Modern Warfare weapons that are underutilized and underappreciated. So when you look at this list, if it has MW next to it and it's down here towards the bottom part of this list, there's a strong chance that they could actually end up adjusting it, and that's going to bring it up into this area here. And if we go back to the tier list, it's going to bring those weapons up into the viable and potentially even the competitive category, which adds even more to this meta. So while the Season 3 meta right now is fantastic and I love it, I think it's about to get even better once we see some more focus on those Modern Warfare weapons. So all around, great news for the meta. But yeah, that is pretty much going to wrap things up for today. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by dropping a like on it. And of course, if you're new here, if you want to stay up to date with everything going on in COD, this is the place to be. News, intel, updates, it's all right here. So feel free to subscribe. That way you'll always know whenever I upload a new video. Once again, and as always, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy. Have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.